China's rise is altering global power relations, reshaping economic debates, and commanding tremendous attention. Despite extensive media and academic scrutiny, the conventional wisdom about China's economy is often wrong. In this regard, Dr. Yukon Huang published a book, Cracking the China Conundrum: Why Conventional Economic Wisdom is Wrong. And now let's listen in to what he has to say. And I'm joined by Dr. Yukon Huang, who is a scholar from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace based in Washington. He's joining us now in Beijing. And he's having a book coming out. It's called Cracking the China Conundrum, mainly talking about where is China's economy and how the rest of the world should look at it. Dr. Huang, what a pleasure to have you back in Beijing.
Oh, great to be here.
Is China exceptional?
I think by the standards of performance in terms of other countries, it is unique. No country has grown at 7 or 8 or 9% a year for more than 30 years in the history of mankind. That makes China unique. I think its movement from a socialist economy to something which is more mixed, and how it's done it, is also truly unique.
Having said that, though, should the rest of the world looking at China's economy in a totally different lens compared to how they're looking at the other economies?
Well, I think this is really an important question here, because if they don't look at China's economy with a different lens, they cannot make judgments like, does this country have a financial problem that will eventually become a crisis?
So you are arguing that a total different set of standards and of statistics, the way of looking at statistics, the system of looking at the economy has to be adjusted in order for China. Is that what you're arguing?
I'm an economist, trained as an economist in the West, okay? There's only one set of economic principles, one set of financial principles. All economies adhere to these principles. What is different is the assumptions. For example, in the West, when we look at an economy, we focus upon a company, a firm. It hires people, fires people, it borrows, invests, it grows. And we use that as a way of looking how well the country is doing. China is different because the state plays a very important role. Local governments also function in an economic sense just like a company. We don't have that counterpart in the West. Therefore, if you look at China, you also have to understand what the local governments are doing, how this affects the economy, their role, the competition, the forces. If you miss that, then you will not have a good grasp about what's happening. And then the question, what should be my policies toward China? It'll be incomplete. So the theory is the same, but the assumptions are different.
But that, in a way, is feeding the theory of so-called exceptionalism. Because people are arguing whether the United States should see itself as exceptional. And people could argue that about any other country in the world, including China.
Right.
So you are saying when you look at China, you have to examine so many other different factors when it comes to Chinese economy. You can't just function as an economist. So anyone who does not have your experience of working in China for 10 years or so would not be able to even to judge where China's economy is and even be able to understand it.
I think the concept of exceptionalism also has what I call a political tone. Exceptionalism means not only am I different, but somehow I'm different in a way that makes me better, or makes me like you should be looking at what I'm doing or following. That's what I call is the undertones of the word exceptionalism. What I would say is China is unique.
This is very complicated. You have just outlined, Dr. Huang. If you look at China's economy, this has never happened before. Let's just say over the past 100 years, probably 200 years. So there are two theories. One is probably like you have to get to understand everything going on in China, the complication of it, in order to understand it. The other thing is that I don't care. There are just certain things I need to look at the economy and eventually come up with a conclusion. Which group would you subscribe to?
First of all, if you are a scholar trying to study China, you can spend your whole life on this.
That's right. And you're still confused.
And you're still confused. So I've been working on China very intensely for now, I'd say, almost 15 years, okay? I'm still learning, okay? And what I've learned saying is you'll never stop, okay? But there are certain things one learns about what will work and what will not work, what is appropriate and not appropriate. Let me give you two things which I really think makes China quite unique when I compare China with other emerging market economies. One of them is that this country, the economy, is extraordinarily competitive. What do I mean by competition? It's always been competitive because it trades with the world, and the global forces impact upon China, and it creates competition. But what makes China really different from, let's say, India, is that there is competition internally in China, across provinces, between state companies and private companies. This is a degree of competition that does not exist elsewhere. So you have internal competition, external competition.
Well, come on, you have it elsewhere. I mean, localities competition, that exists in any other country.
No, if you look at India, the states in India do not compete with each other. Okay? They don't invest to develop whatever. They tend to be protected. Okay? They tend to look at their own, the governor of a state in India feels very much like, I'm only dealing with this. What makes China different? Your governors and party secretaries rotate. Okay? But they're also instructed while they're there to try to upgrade and improve the companies, the livelihoods, the poverty conditions.
Right.
If they do well, then the leadership does well. Okay? This creates tremendous competition across provinces. This is something we don't see in other kinds of countries. And I would say this kind of uniqueness comes partly from this kind of competitive forces. Remember, this is a mixed economy, socialist roots. The criticism of socialist economies was always that they were inefficient, that companies couldn't compete. So the big question has always been, how come a socialist economy like China, going through transition, how come it's so efficient in some ways of being able to compete globally?
So how the rest of the world should look at China's economy? We have heard from different economists, all of them big names, well respected so far. Some are arguing about a beautiful prospect of the Chinese economy. Others have been warning every year with different possibilities of the collapse of the Chinese economy.
You make a very valid point. In my book, I point out that here's a country. It's carefully scrutinized and studied by everyone. Yet views about what's happening in its prospects are so extreme. It is because China economy, as we just discussed, doesn't fit any textbook very easily. Okay? Now, I have constructed, for example, what I call a likely path. That likely path basically recognizes the following. No country grows at a huge rate forever. When you get richer, you mature, your growth rate declines. The big issue then is how fast. If China could grow at, say, 5.5% average for the next 10 to 15 years, this would be extraordinary. But it is still declining. So the question is, what can the government do to achieve this? And how should the outside world look at this?
There are several things, Dr. Huang. The world has evolved in terms of the way it looks at China. Before and after the reform and opening up, of course, this is a big moment. Then Asian financial crisis, another big moment. Chinese economy endured that and even prospered despite of the pains it also went through, but certainly stood there for the rest of the world. And then you have the recent financial crisis, 2008, in which China seemed to very much function as a responsible stakeholder. And now you go to another stage in which the world have very different views about what exactly should be globalization. And you see different interpretations of that you see now from the Trump administration and now from the Xi Jinping administration here in China. So are we at another critical stage to study China? And also for China to re-examine itself to figure out a way to go.
Let's step back and ask, what did the global financial crisis do to reshape opinions of everyone about the future growth prospects?
What?
Okay. I think the fundamental issue that's changed is a perception that emerging market economies are now going faster. They're more integrated in the world. This has had a pressure on employment and wages in the West. This is a large factor in creating what I call this feeling of protectionism in Europe and the United States. And they see this as partially the consequence of countries like China and also in India, rest of East Asia. They've become fully into the global markets, and it has led to tremendous productivity increases, consumer goods of higher quality and lower prices, so consumers have benefited. But the concern has been about wages and job creation in the West, which has stagnated. This has led to a fundamental change on the role of trade. Ironically, 10, 15 years ago, the West was in favor of more liberal trade. The emerging market economies were concerned that they couldn't compete. Now it's completely different. Emerging market economies are in favor of more globalization, and the so-called better-off countries are actually in favor of more protectionism. So this is a completely different from what we've seen.
But when you think about 15 years ago, emerging economies, developing countries do not have much voices in deciding what the mechanism should be. And now, when their strength is growing, and when certainly there are different views as to what the best interest would be for this group and for that group, there's likely to be the possibility of conflict about how to define a system or redefine a system.
And there you're absolutely right. And one thing we've seen already, for example, in terms of the governance structure, you're moving far away from the G7 as the sole means for addressing the issue. So the G20 is becoming a much more format, emerging market, developed countries coming together. No one, however, has quite defined what should everyone want to be working toward. And I'll give you a few things that I think are really sensitive issues. Trade and services, the movement of labor, much more contentious issues today. 10, 15 years ago, people were just talking about tariffs, trading goods. Now something quite different. The role of state enterprises, environmental issues, labor issues, all much more sensitive today. And there's no consensus about how you deal with this. And there are stark differences between the views of the emerging market economies and the G7 economies.
And therefore, at the end of the day, I think the question is, when we are talking about the Chinese economy, or in the future probably, the economy of the other rising, developing and emerging economies, can we still look at it with many of the earlier indicators, standards, and also perceptions? Or we have to examine it from a very different way?
Well, I think there's a couple things that we've also learned right away. OECD rich countries, they've grown to a certain level. The wages have become stagnant. Employment has become a big issue. China has kind of an unusual situation. In some ways, unemployment was much more of a concern 10 years ago than it was today, because China had to absorb all the people in rural areas, people were being laid off in state enterprises, they had to be employed. Now China's labor force is shrinking. It doesn't have the massive need to generate jobs. But China's well-educated college graduates and other skilled workers continue to have aspirations, and the issues now become wage growth, innovative, productivity, environmental concerns. This is already affecting the leadership here in this country. Environmental concerns, for example, here in China, are much more serious and much more of a focus of public opinion and political opinion than it was 10 years ago. Innovation, job, technology, huge issue here in China. These are issues which we're not seeing as particularly relevant 10 years ago, but today they're entirely relevant. So I do think that these kinds of issues are affecting the Chinese system. They're also having a huge discussion and debate in the West, which is they have not been able to fully resolve the challenges they face on these points.
This is the time of the 19th Party Congress. That's supposed to be one of the most important political meetings for China every 5 years. So you think about China's leadership and the leadership of the CPC. Three things going on. One is internal pressure and demands of the people on environmental issues, the economy getting better, employment rates, and many other things, livelihood. There are a lot of expectations. On the other hand, you also see the rising confidence in China about the country itself, about its, so far, the system, how it works, and possibly about a possible path China could create for the others for inspiration in the future. But the third point is, it also has something to do with the reflections others have about where China is and how they would like to deal with China, for example, from the United States. So you see the Chinese leadership and the CPC leadership probably are looking at this whole array of plates and looking at all these different possibilities. What would this mean for a decision-making process as an observer of China?
Well, let's think about what is fundamentally different economically, which is my focus today, than 10 years ago. You have a huge rising middle class. The country is much more urban than it used to be. Services have become the major driver of growth as opposed to industry. This is a different China than was 10 years ago. dynamic new economies in China in services, e-commerce, the internet. They're becoming globally significant players. Certain sectors in China today have gone faster and are more advanced than they are in the West. China skipped, for example, the traditional payment systems, so everyone using mobile payment systems.
That's right.
The West is still dependent upon credit cards and cash and checks. China's skipped that totally. China's Alibaba, Tencent, other companies have combined functions in ways which the West has not even thought about. Okay, so this is, in fact, as you say, a much more dynamic, much more confident China in many areas, but there are many other areas which still lag. China is very strange in the sense that when you look at its best performing companies, they're world class. But when you get down to the lower levels, they have many companies whose performance is way below global norms. So this gap is the widest that we've ever seen. So what can China offer to the West now? It actually can offer a huge rising middle class, a system which is much more confident and potentially can be much more open to, frankly, more foreign competition. So I think China should actually say to the West and the United States, let's renegotiate and talk about the bilateral investment treaty.
Well, China's already talking about that, right?
It has been for years.
It take a long, long time.
But it's been put on the back burner. The U.S. has been less enthusiastic about it recently because it's been focusing much more on trade. So what should China basically say? China should actually say, actually, the issue is no longer trade. The issue is really about market access. That you can invest more in my country for certain reasons and access, and I can invest more in your country. We should actually elevate the bilateral investment treaty as the major forum for discussing issues rather than getting into a protectionist kind of throwing charges against each other, which is unfortunately what's been happening in the last several months.
Dr. Yukon Huang, what a pleasure to have you here in our Beijing studio, and congratulations for that book, particularly focusing on issue about China that the rest of the world have been thinking so hard. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.